This is the best possible day on the internet for a weird nerd like me because we have a front row seat to how fascism collapses in on itself. Quick political history lesson. Two of the major academics who have studied the rise and fall of fascist regimes in the past are Robert Paxton and Jason Stanley. The major contribution that Robert Paxton made to the study of fascism is that it has five distinct stages. At first, it emerges out of common disillusionment with the current system. Then it has to establish itself as a viable force and a viable political party. The next stage, it uses this viability to gain partnerships on the right so that it can have a chance at taking power. And then it takes power and begins to exercise it. It begins to dominate institutions and implement its own reforms. But because fascism is not merely an irrational, but actually an anti-rational philosophy, it relies on consistent emotional appeal and drama to sustain itself. It typically does this through further radicalization and internal purges. This is why at any given point, the beating heart of a fascist regime is actually incredibly unstable because it's largely personality driven. Now, Jason Stanley adds to the discussion about fascism that he believes fascism is a cult of the leader. Very rarely in fascist histories do you see a fascist movement emerging without reference to a strong personality at its center. You can have a growing fascist movement without a central figure, or a sort of leaderless cultural fascism like we see in places like Israel. But more often than not, fascist movements require a strong personality, a leader who emerges from within their ranks, paints himself first as an outsider and a savior, and then begins to form coalitions across various power structures. The problem is that a personality-driven political philosophy can only sustain one personality. So all throughout history, you basically see the equivalent of the Donald Trump, Elon Musk falling out. It happened in 1937 when Francisco Franco and his monarchists purged Manuel Hedilla, who was the leader of the Falangists, the actual fascist party in Spain, because he refused to unify the parties. When Joseph Stalin instituted personality-driven red fascism in the USSR, he relied on lots of dramatic and often highly public internal purges. And of course, the leader of 1940s Germany did this a lot. First with Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the SA and wanted a more radical approach, a second revolution inside the ranks of the NSDAP. Germany's would-be dictator didn't like this and decided to purge Röhm and all of his people in an event called the Night of the Long Knives. He did it again in 1941 when Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess was starting to outshine him in popularity and took an unsanctioned trip to Great Britain, after which he was branded insane and kicked out of the party. The pattern is consistent and ruthless in fascist history. Any fascist co-leader, whether he's a street boss, a general, an ideologue, or an oligarch, is only tolerated for as long as he does not outshine the central figure of the fascist movement. When a rival's wealth, power, or charisma begins to threaten that of the leader, they become disgraced and cast out. A very important lesson for would-be strongmen is that fascism can only sustain one ego at its center. And the reason that fascism will always fail is because it rewards loyalty over competence. This is inherently unsustainable. And so entropy sets in, the final stage of fascism, when it can no longer sustain its internal self-radicalization and it collapses in on itself. There's a silver lining there for all those who wish to see it, which is that we might be nearing the end of this fascist cycle. The problem is that these stages have a way of repeating themselves, and if President Trump can paint this as a huge betrayal enough to radicalize his base even further, well then we repeat this cycle all over again.